Welcome to the Universal Spirit Sakimori Laboratory. Thank you very much for your visit. First, let's look back at the understanding of Rudolf Steiner that we discussed in the 10th session last time. When Jesus was 30 years old, his ego left his body and was replaced by the Christ entity. Maitreya Bodhisattva will live this type of life in every reincarnation. When Maitreya Bodhisattva becomes a Buddha, at the age of 30 or 31, another entity will possess his body. Such a Bodhisattva never reveals his true form when he is young, and at the age of 30 or 31, when another entity occupies his body, he reveals a completely different spiritual character. And we have been verifying that Onisaburo Deguchi became possessed by the spirit of Susanoo no Mikoto just before he turned 30. However, in the case of Onisaburo Deguchi, there is another 30-year model. This time, we would like to examine this other 30-year training and Maitreya Bodhisattva, who lives the pattern of Christ but does not call himself Christ. In the Owamoto Divine Message written by the founder of Owamoto, now Deguchi, there is a phrase, soul reorganization and reconstruction in 30 years. And Onisaburo Deguchi, at the age of 27, from March 1, 1898, for a week, practiced on Takakuma Mountain as a model of Maitreya Bodhisattva, and on March 3, 1928, at the age of 57, the Moroku Festival was held. In other words, it took exactly 30 years from the start of the training on Takakuma Mountain to the declaration of Maitreya's birth. Also, Onisaburo Deguchi is well aware of this 30-year training period, and he writes about it as follows. In this text, Onisaburo Deguchi refers to himself as a female soul born in a male body, and now Deguchi as a male soul born in a female body. However, for the sake of clarity, I will translate Onisaburo as I and now as the founder. The founder's physical body entered the divine work of John at the age of 57, and for the next 27 years, she wielded the divine brush to promote a major reform of the material world. Even now, after entering the spiritual world, she continues to serve in her divine work. Next, I have been serving in the divine work for 30 years, waiting for the divine government of 5, 6, 7 Maitreya unifying the world ethically, and making people bathe in the virtue of the divine emperor. Since the start of my divine service, this year marks the full 23 years, and the remaining 7 years are indeed the most significant challenges in fulfilling the mission for women. In Owamoto Divine Message, it is written that soul reorganization and reconstruction will be done in 30 years. The completion of the founder's 30 years of divine work was on January 1, 1922. The completion of my 30 years of training is scheduled for February 9, 1928. When you think carefully about the content written in Owamoto Shinyu as soul reorganization and reconstruction, the physical reorganization by the baptism of water is 30 years, which is the divine work that John should serve. On the other hand, the spiritual reconstruction by the baptism of fire requires 30 years before and after, which is the divine revelation. However, the divine revelation of 30 years is an indication of the main points, and it is by no means definitive. In this way, considering that the first training on Takakuma Mountain was conducted for a week from March 1, 1898, it turns out that exactly 30 years after the start of this training, the declaration of Maitreya's advent and the Moroku Festival were held. From the above, it can be seen that in the case of Onisaburo Deguchi, he has gone through 2 types of 30 years of training. Next, Onisaburo Deguchi has long been writing 5, 6, 7 and reading it as Moroku. As I explained before, this indicates that there was a legend that Maitreya Bodhisattva will become a Buddha 5.67 billion years later. And Onisaburo Deguchi himself declared the advent of Maitreya at the age of 56 years and 7 months, and ascended in the month of 76 years and 5 months. It is therefore believed that this period was indicative of the Moroku activity. This timeline summarizes the contents of the previous episode 10 and the 30 years of training examined in this issue. First, the light blue text represents the training period of Susanoo no Mikoto. Onisaburo Deguchi was born on July 12, 1871, in the old calendar. Next is the content of the dark blue text. Then, Susanoo Makoto becomes possessed by Onisaburo and argues with now Deguchi about Amaterasu Mikami. That is the Battle of Fire and Water on July 20, 1901, in the new calendar. In other words, Onisaburo Deguchi's personality changes due to possession by a god at the age of 30. And from this time, he begins to walk the same pattern as Christ. According to Onisaburo Deguchi, Susanoo Makoto is a god who bears the sins of people as a substitute. This is the same as the work of the Redeemer in Christianity. And then, the advent of Maitreya is declared in 1828. Next is the explanation of the red text. Onisaburo Deguchi is training in a cave on Takaguma Mountain in March 1898. We examined in Episode 4 that this coincides with the legend of Maitreya Bodhisattva in Buddhism. From this time, after a 30-year training period, Onisaburo declares the advent of Maitreya in March 1928. And then comes the period of the dark red text. At this time, Onisaburo was 56 years and 7 months old since his birth. And from here, he ascends at the age of 76 years and 5 months on January 19, 1948. In other words, the meaning of writing 5, 6, 7 and reading it as Maitreya is also shown here. And during this period, the same phenomenon that occurred within the Owamoto sect also occurred in Japan. We touched on this a little in the previous episode, but we will explain the specific content in Episode 17. Furthermore, it is also during this period that Onisaburo Deguchi is considered to have realized the second coming of Christ as Mirokugat. We will explain this in Episodes 16 and 17. In this way, Onisaburo Deguchi has been training for 30 years to perform the work of Susanoo Makoto. Furthermore, he has been training for 30 years to work as Maitreya God. And the activity of Susanoo Makoto was a period of suffering and redemption. Also, the activity of Maitreya God was a period to fulfill the prophecy of Christ's second coming. Steiner spoke as follows in his lecture on the Gospel of Matthew on September 10, 1910. Assuming that Jeshuben Pandira, who was stoned to death almost a century before the appearance of Christ in Palestine as the son of Pandira, is reincarnated in the present day and teaches the appearance of Christ, that Christ must not be the physical Christ, but must appear dressed in ether. Just as he appeared to Paul on the outskirts of Damascus. And we can recognize Jeshuben Pandira, who has been reborn at this point. However, what is important on the other hand is that we learn that Christ will appear in our time from the existence that will someday become Maitreya Buddha. That is, to find out the existence of the new Essenes. We must be very careful not to make a wrong judgment about the Essenes who are resurrected in the present day. We can give one sure sign of Jesus ben Pandira who is resurrected in the present day. That is, this person does not call himself Christ. In the present day, anyone who suggests in some way that the same power as Jesus of Nazareth is alive and working within them, by making such a claim, is showing that they are the impostor of that pioneer who lived a century before Christ. Such a claim shows that the person making the claim is not that person. The claim itself that there is some relationship with Christ clearly shows more than anything else that a false prophet is appearing there. The influence of fakes in this field is incredibly large. Because modern people are swinging between extremes. On the one hand, modern people do not want to recognize the spiritual power that works among people. When an original spiritual power is shown, modern people do not want to recognize its talent and ability. It's always and everywhere. Newspapers also repeatedly make such remarks. Although the highest personality on earth should be born in our time is completely insensitive to it, does not pay attention to it, and just leaves it to its course. The reason why Steiner asserts this can be understood by reading the signs of the coming of the Son of Man in chapter 21 of the Gospel of Luke, Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13. In it, Jesus Christ himself is clearly prophesying as follows. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Savior Christ, or the end is near. Do not follow them. On the other hand, As if to prove this, Onisaburo Deguchi says, "There seems to be someone among the Owamoto people who likens me to Jesus of Nazareth, Christ, which is really a great nuisance. I hereby declare that the Christ and Jesus of Nazareth that I once explained in the spiritual world story are completely different people." Furthermore, 5 years earlier, he spoke of his spiritual mission as follows. "There are people who say that I am the second coming of Christ. My disciples also believe that I am the second coming of Christ, and even consider it an honor for me, and there are those who argue strongly by citing the Bible, which is a very welcome nuisance. Christ, although prophesied by John that he will baptize with fire, finally returned to the spirit world without baptizing with fire. His work was immature, and was it not interrupted by the interference of the devil? I have come for the completion of the divine work, to baptize with fire. It is for the purpose of preaching and transmitting the gospel of God all over the world. And I am already baptizing the whole world with fire. Isn't that something that my followers witness closely day and night? Those of you who have a small heart and feel honored to liken me to Christ, who baptized only a part of Asia Minor with water, follow me with a great ambition." In this way, Onisaburo Deguchi strongly asserts that he is neither Jesus nor Christ, and strongly and firmly denies being called the second coming of Christ. Also, while Onisaburo Deguchi may seem to be criticizing Jesus Christ, that is not the case at all. These were words meant to strongly deny and prohibit the misconceptions and rumors of believers who called him the second coming of Christ. This is because Deguchi Onisaburo had the following to say about Buddhism, Christianity, and Shintoism. There are Christians who have tried to remove miracles from the Bible. They are in error. If you remove miracles from Christianity, it is no longer a religion but an ethic. I believe in Buddhism, Christianity, and Shintoism. I am a believer in all of Buddhism, Yaeso, and Shinto. When the true teachings of Christ are no longer transmitted, and in Buddhism when the true teachings of the Buddha are no longer transmitted, that is the end of the world. In other words, it means the destruction of the spirit of Christ and the destruction of the spirit of Buddhism. It is at this time that true Christianity and true Buddhism must arise. Moreover, Onisaburo Deguchi was actively preaching around the world during his lifetime. In that sense, it is a fact that he preached to many more people than in the time of Jesus Christ. Furthermore, Steiner was saying earlier, he was stoned to death almost a century before the appearance of Christ in Palestine as the son of Pandira. Onisaburo Deguchi suddenly set off for Mongolia with his excellent disciples on February 13, 1924. There, he was welcomed as a person who had come again as Genghis Khan, who had been handed down as a legend in Mongolia. However, due to local power struggles, the local people who welcomed Onisaburo and others were killed. And Onisaburo Deguchi and others also became prisoners and were sentenced to death by shooting. However, just before the execution, the gun misfired, temporarily postponing the killing. Immediately after that, Onisaburo Deguchi and others were protected by the Japanese embassy. Owamoto refers to this incident as the distress at Paintera. And this reminds us of the scene of the execution of Jesus ben Pandira, which Steiner was talking about, or the mystery of Golgotha of Christ. This content was introduced in Episode 5, but Onisaburo Deguchi says, "The Owamoto incident started and went to Mongolia in 3 years, and after another 3 years, it was acquitted, a total of 72 months, that is, 36 months and 36 months, miroku, miroku. In Japanese, 3 is mi and 6 is roku. Therefore, when you combine 3 and 6, it becomes the pronunciation of miroku. This means Maitreya in Japanese. The words may have been a reminder of the fate of Maitreya Bodhisattva, who was executed in a past life. In this respect as well, the characteristics of Jesus ben Pandira, who was reincarnated as shown by Steiner, and the words and deeds of Onisaburo Deguchi are very consistent. If so, the Maitreya Bodhisattva, who anthroposophy has been trying to find as the highest personality on earth will be born in our time, is Onisaburo Deguchi, and the new Essenes resurrected in modern times were the Owamoto of that time. The possibility is even higher. If there is someone who asserts that Onisaburo Deguchi is not Maitreya Bodhisattva, I would like to ask the opposite question. Then, besides Onisaburo Deguchi, was there another person who showed more characteristics of Maitreya Bodhisattva? Did that person achieve the second coming of Christ? Who is that? If you cannot answer clearly, we will be forced to wait until the next life to conclude to meet Christ. Indeed, it's easy for people who don't know anything about Onisaburo Deguchi to doubt it and deny it without checking it out for themselves. However, if one cannot understand who Maitreya Bodhisattva is, he will also lose the chance to understand the second coming of Christ as predicted by Steiner 100 years ago in 1911. In the Tales of the Spiritual World, Onisaburo Deguchi talks about Onokoro Island, or Japan, in the spiritual world, and the reproduction of the model of John and Christ as follows. Before the Great Flood, divine work was initiated centered on Jerusalem, where Kuniharudachi no Makoto meaning Kunito Kotachi no Makoto appeared as a split spirit, Kunidakiko, and descended to Onokoro Island, Japan. Along with Susanoo no Makoto God, it was to build the foundation of the politics of the gods Maitreya. From then on, Onokoro Island was determined to be the land of divine work for world unification. This overlaps with the circumstances in which the Kunitachi no Kanjin retreated from Jerusalem, the center of the world, to Japan in the northeast due to the betrayal of the evil god, and came to be called Ushitora no Kanjin. In the material world, it is also reflected in a theory in ancient history that the 10 lost tribes of Judah headed to Asia, and one of them, the Semitic tribe, came to Japan. This also leads to the profound relationship between Israel and Ise Shrine. At the same time, it also leads to the convergence of Christianity and Shinto. However, we will omit this. Thus, according to Onisaburo Deguchi's perception, the Jewish secret became the Japanese gods program. Steiner, on the other hand, strongly argued that the Maitreya of the 20th century was a being preparing the biblical prophecy of the second coming of Christ to the etheric world, but said that the person should never be named Christ. This is something that Christ himself spoke of in the Bible, and for those who have entered into the mysteries, it is an extremely important recognition and clue that indicates the Maitreya Bodhisattva. In this way, according to Steiner's understanding, Onisaburo Deguchi lived in the mold of Christ as Maitreya God. And by the power of Kotodama, he published the tales of the spiritual world, conducted missionary work around the world, performed the baptism of fire, purified the spirit, and saved people. Onisaburo Deguchi spoke about the fire baptism as follows. To baptize with fire means to spiritually save people. This is the Mahayana teaching of Buddhism, which is to burn out all modern errors and spread the teachings of truth. To baptize with water means to physically save people. Fire is spirit and water is body. And Onisaburo Deguchi spoke of his mission as follows. My coming is for the completion of the divine work, to baptize with fire. It is to preach and transmit the gospel of God all over the world. As I repeat, Steiner also spoke about the characteristics of Maitreya Buddha as follows. The life of Maitreya Buddha will take the same form as the life of Christ, as revealed by spiritual inquiry. Finally, I would like to organize the contents of the previous and this time in a chronological table. This is a brief chronology showing the mechanism of the miniature model that Ushitora no Kanjin Kunito Kotachi no Makoto performed and the activities of Onisaburo Deguchi. First, I will explain the blue characters. This is the period between when Deguchi Onisaburo began his activities as Susanoo no Makoto at the age of 30 and the descent of Maitreya Bodhisattva. During this period, the world situation was reflected in the order of Owamoto as a miniature model. Therefore, during this period, Onisaburo Deguchi is misunderstood by many officers and believers in the sect as an existence that shows the type of evil as Susanoo no Makoto. In fact, Onisaburo was in a situation where his manuscripts were burned and his life was threatened, which was also the time when he qualified as a priest and worked at a non-Owamoto shrine. However, the fact that Onisaburo Deguchi had been expelled within the Owamoto sect was showing the situation where justice all over the world was oppressed by evil as a miniature model. At the same time, it was also the type of redemption of the sins of the people of the world by the Messiah in Christianity. And, as if to symbolize that the world situation was transcribed to Owamoto, after World War I, the first Owamoto incident occurred and the facilities of the sect were destroyed. In fact, Onisaburo Deguchi was detained in prison for 126 days in 1921 due to the first Owamoto incident religious persecution. Furthermore, the period of this passion was also when he was driven to the brink of being shot in Mongolia's Paintera in 1924. It is considered to show the type of Golgotha of Christ. In this way, Deguchi Onisaburo showed the type of the Passion of Christ in the period of Susanu's activity. Next, I will explain about the red characters. Onisaburo Deguchi, after 30 years of training as Maitreya Bodhisattva from the training at Mount Takakuma, arrives at the advent of Maitreya. Already at this time, a microcosm reflecting the world situation had been completed in the Owamoto religion. And from this time onwards, the situation of the Owamoto religion in Japan began to be projected onto the situation of the Owamoto in the world. In other words, the blue letter period was a period of projection from the world to the Owamoto, while the red letter period became a period of projection from the Owamoto to the world. The advent of Maitreya God was declared at the start of this miniature model. Therefore, the problems within the Owamoto sect, which reflected the evil situation of the world, are improved. Then, with Onisaburo Deguchi, who is active as Maitreya God, at the center, the propagation to not only all over Japan but also the world is actively started. However, as Owamoto's activities spread rapidly, the movement came to be seen as a reform movement against the state and the government. Furthermore, in Japan, where the emperor was worshipped as a living god, the Owamoto sect, which revered Onisaburo as a holy teacher, was viewed as dangerous by the Empire of Japan, leading to the second Owamoto incident, second religious persecution. Thus, the Owamoto, which is a miniature model of the world situation, is oppressed, the facilities of the sect are destroyed, and the land of the divine garden is also confiscated. Therefore, just as the Empire of Japan destroyed Owamoto, Japan was thoroughly destroyed by the Second World War from the world's powers and was occupied by the GHQ, that is, the General Headquarters. However, the 3,000-year mechanism of Ashitora no Kanjin had inscribed extremely important evidence in history through the Second Owamoto incident and the Second World War. This is proof that the prophecies of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, signs before the coming of the Son of Man and the prophecies of the Second Coming, have been fulfilled. And the fulfillment of this biblical prophecy means Steiner's prophecy of the appearance of Christ in the etheric world. It is the main theme of the Steiner Code series to verify that it is the result of the activities of the large spiritual group centered on Jesus in the spiritual world, which has been spoken about in numerous spiritual communications. The details about the fulfillment of this prophecy will be explained from episode 16 to episode 20 of this series. However, in order to clearly understand its true meaning, it is necessary to further examine Steiner's recognition and the footsteps of Onisaburo Deguchi. In conclusion, in the 11th session, we deepened our understanding of the characteristics of Maitreya Bodhisattva presented by Rudolf Steiner, namely, another ego descends at the age of 30 and he never calls himself Christ. And we have verified that Onisaburo Deguchi has been acting accordingly. In the next episode, the 12th, we will verify the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age and the end of the Dark Age, which Rudolf Steiner and Onisaburo Deguchi talked about. And this realization will be closely linked to the understanding of God's 3,000-year program, the reorganization and reconstruction of the soul and the significance of the second crucifixion and the return of Christ in future anthroposophy. Thank you very much for watching until the end. We look forward to your continued support.